Hello, this is 5.7 geometry using congruent triangles. So this whole time in chapter 5, we've been talking about congruent triangles. And if two triangles are congruent, it doesn't matter how they're congruent. They could be congruent by side, angle, side, 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 angle, angle, side, side, angle, or hypotenuse, leg. Or it could just be given that the two triangles are congruent. But if two triangles are congruent, what that means is all corresponding parts are congruent. So if you prove something or two triangles congruent by, say, side, 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 what then that implies is all of the corresponding angles are congruent, and so on. So if two triangles are congruent, regardless of how they're congruent, all their corresponding parts are congruent, which leads to the statement corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And instead of having to write that out every single time, we use the acronym CPCTC, which stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And then we could specifically use that as a reason in our proofs, and we will. So say you're trying to prove that, two angles of a triangle are congruent. If you can show or prove that the whole triangles are congruent first, then the corresponding angles would be congruent. Or say you're trying to prove that two sides of a triangle or two sides of two triangles are congruent, then again, if you show that those two triangles are congruent anyway by say side, 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 angle, hypotenuse, leg, whatever, then that means those corresponding sides would be congruent. Now looking at a couple of examples, if you look at the examples, it says explain how to prove that the statement is true. So I don't necessarily need to write a proof. It doesn't say write a proof or prove, but it says just explain how to prove that the statement is true. So you want to prove that UV, that side or that segment, this segment right here, and I'm going to use a different color, but side UV is congruent to side XV. So I want to prove that those two sides of the two triangles are congruent. Those are parts of the triangles. Those are two sides of each of the triangles. And if I can prove somehow that these two triangles are congruent, TUV and WXV, then that means that these sides are congruent. It would also mean that angle U is congruent to angle X, but I don't need to prove that. It would also mean that side UT is congruent to side WX. I don't need that, but that would be true if these two triangles are congruent. So if you take a look at the triangles, here's what we have so far. These two angles are congruent. These two sides are congruent. There's no just angle side or side angle theorem. But if you take a look at the triangles a little bit more carefully, you might be able to figure out exactly how these two triangles could be congruent. So if you thought, well, these two angles right here are vertical angles, they are congruent. So you could show that the vertical angles are congruent first. That's specifically using the vertical angles theorem. And if those vertical angles are congruent, then the two triangles are congruent by angle, side, angle, side, angle. And then if the two triangles are congruent by angle, side UV corresponds with side XV, and then those would be congruent as well. So I just wrote out exactly what I just said. The two triangles are congruent specifically by angle, side, angle. And then since side UV and VX are corresponding in the two congruent triangles, they would be congruent specifically by CPCTC, or their corresponding parts of congruent triangles. Therefore, they are congruent. Okay. Look at example 2. Maybe you could try to figure out how to show that side TS is congruent to side VR before I specifically go over it with you. So here's what we have. We have angle T and angle V are right angles. Therefore, these are right triangles. RT is congruent to UV. Those are actually legs of a right triangle. RU is congruent to RS. Those are the hypotenuses of the right triangles. So these two triangles would be congruent by hypotenuse leg, which means the corresponding parts are congruent. And these two sides, TS and VR, are corresponding parts. Therefore, they would be congruent. And I'll write all that out. So I just wrote out everything that I just mentioned. You can take a look. It doesn't have to be worded exactly like that, but in the next part of the video, we'll go over example number 3.